Okay, this is the 2.7 extra notes, left off where we were talking about how quadratic, polynomial, and rational inequalities can be solved, but that we use a chart method for solving them, and it has to do with what are called critical values. So I'm going to pick back up and do the examples that we skipped over in class, and then I will post this to the YouTube channel. So we're looking at example 1D was the one we did not do together in class. Supposed to try to find all solutions. So the first step is always to get this so that everything's on one side and zero's on the other. So we will subtract over the 9. And then this is two perfect squares, so we'll factor that into 4x plus 3 and 4x minus 3, still greater than 0. You can't set those greater than 0 and solve. That is not how this works. It is not an equal sign. So we find out what they would be if they equaled 0 just to find what are called the critical values. Also known as zeros for us, because they're x-intercepts essentially. So subtract 3, divide by 4, you get negative 3/4. Add 3, divide by 4, you get positive 3/4. Your next step is to then put this on a number line so that we can do a chart method. The reason you don't just say, oh, let's set both those greater than 0 is because it takes both factors to create the sign that is going to make this greater than 0. So you can't think of them as one at a time. So when you do your chart, you put your in order from least to greatest, so negative 3/4 to 3/4. Our intervals would then be negative infinity to negative 3/4, and it's a parentheses because there's no equal to bar, negative 3/4 to 3/4, and 3/4, that's a horrible 3, to positive infinity. Once you've got your intervals set up, you pick test values, and then you consider how each of the test value numbers you pick affects the sign of each factor. Then to take care of the fact that it is being multiplied together, we will look for what's called the overall sign, and we want that to be greater than 0. So let's pick test values. Less than negative 3/4, I would say negative 1. Between negative 3/4 and 3/4, I would pick 0. Bigger than 3/4, I would pick positive 1. And remember, all I care about is signs, because essentially we're looking for something that when you multiply together, it is greater than 0. So 4 times negative 1 is negative 4, plus 3 would still be negative. 4 times negative 1 would be negative 4, minus 3 more would still be negative. A negative times a negative is a positive. 4 times 0 is 0, plus 3 would be positive. 4 times 0 is 0, minus 3 would be negative. So that's an overall negative sign, because you're multiplying opposite signs. 4 times 1 plus 3 would be positive. 4 times 1 is 4, minus 3 would also still be positive. Positive times positive is positive. Because we were looking for greater than 0, the true values are the pluses. So my intervals for my final answer are negative infinity to negative 3/4, unioned with 3/4 to infinity. Okay, the next one that we skipped over was F. Back up. So for F, it's 4 terms, so we should try to do factor by grouping. I'm just going to try to group them the way that they are. I can pull an x squared out of the first pair. That would leave me with a 2x minus 3. I cannot pull out any numbers from the second pair or x's, but if you have a leading coefficient, you have to pull out the negative, and if there's nothing else in common, we pull out of 1. So this would be 2x and minus 3, because that would change those signs. Pull the 2x minus 3 to the front. This leaves me with an x squared minus 1, which if you're not paying attention, you will miss. That is two perfect squares, so this is going to factor again into an x plus 1 and an x minus 1, less than or equal to 0. Our critical values would be add 3, divide by 2, so 3/2, subtract 1 over, add 1 over. So I have a negative 1, a 1, and a 3/2. We then place those critical values on a number line from least to greatest. So there's going to be 3 different critical values. Negative 1 is the smallest, positive 1 is the next smallest, and 3/2 is 1.5, so it's the biggest. We write our intervals. This time all of them are going to be brackets because of the equal to bar. So negative infinity to negative 1 bracket, bracket negative 1 to 1, bracket 1 to 3/2, and bracket 3/2 to infinity. We have to pick a test value or TV for each, and then each of the three factors needs to be represented in our chart. So 2x minus 3, x plus 1, x minus 1. Separate this from my work. And then we're looking for an overall sign of less than or equal to 0. So we want negatives as our final result. Something less than -1 would be -2. Something between -1 and 1 would be 0. This is a little harder because that's 1 to 1.5, so we have to pick something in between, maybe 1.2. Bigger than 1.5, I can use +2. So once you've figured out what your numbers are going to be, you have to think, when I plug them in, does the sign come out positive or negative? So 2 times -2 is -4, minus 3 more would be negative. -2 plus 1 would be a -1, so that's negative. -2 minus 1 would be -3, so that's negative. When you multiply three negatives together, that ends up staying negative. 2 times 0 is 0, minus 3 would be negative. 0 plus 1 is positive. 0 minus 1 is negative. Two negatives multiplied together make a positive. Be careful with the 2 times the 1.2. You need to make sure you actually check that. 1.2 times 2 is 2.4, and 2.4 minus 3 would actually still be negative. 1.2 plus 1 is positive. 1.2 minus 1 is also positive. One negative makes it an overall negative. 2 times 2, because that's our next test value, is 4. Minus 3 would be positive. 2 plus 1 is positive. 2 minus 1 is also positive, so 3 positives multiplies to a positive. We were looking for less than or equal to 0, so that means we're looking for a negative sign overall. So that means that our intervals are -infinity to -1, union with 1 to 3/2. And do note that each critical value shows up in at least one of the bracket interval parts for our final answer. If any of them had been completely skipped over, we would need to also list that singular value because these are where you equal 0. But we were okay because each number got represented somewhere. Okay, so that takes us to the, excuse my allergies by the way, that takes us to the rational inequalities. These are the ones that are a little trickier because there's a numerator and a denominator. So in these, you break this into pieces of what we call the zeros, which come from the top, and the undefined, which come from the bottom. But the problem is that this follows our sign, which in this case would be a less than or equal to. This will always be open. You cannot have equal to 0 in a denominator, so you just have to be careful with those. This is not completely factored. I am going to change some things. X plus 3 squared, by the way, is always going to be positive. This is 2 minus x. I could write that as 2 minus x, or I could switch it around and pull out a negative, but I think it's easier just to leave it like this. I have an x plus 4, and x squared minus 4 is x plus 2, x minus 2, less than or equal to 0. So let's talk about the top. -3 would be considered a 0, and 2 minus 2, so positive 2 would be considered a 0. On the bottom, it would be a -4, -2, and a 2. Anytime something appears in both top and bottom, we go with the bottom for its is it opened or closed. So this one, that's why I marked that out. But we are going to consider all the factors, and in fact, if you want, you could write x plus 3 twice because it's going to be squared. So that might make that easier. You're going to have actually 6 factors in your chart this time. So let's make it. So smallest number would be -4. Next smallest number would be -3. Next smallest number in the list is -2. And the largest number in the list over here is a +2. Be careful, remember anything from the denominator is always open. So -4, -2, and 2 are considered to be open circles. -3 is closed, not because they have to alternate, but because this has an equal to bar. So that helps me write my intervals. This is -infinity to -4 parentheses, parentheses -4 to -3 with a bracket, -3 with a bracket to -2 parentheses, -2 to 2 both with parentheses, and 2 to infinity with both parentheses. We have to do our test values. I'm actually going to rewrite some of this because I got a little too far over. So this is less than or equal to 0. So my factors, I'm going to have to look at x plus 3 twice because it was squared. I have to do my 2 minus x, my x plus 4. And remember, we talked about in class, you do not cancel anything even if it matches on top and bottom, because that would make you miss a 0 or an undefined value. So we just leave everything completely factored but not canceled. So then I'm going to get my signs, and I hope for an overall less than or equal to 0, which is a negative. So less than -4, I would say -5. Between -4 and -3 is not good because it's going to be just one number, so we have to go with a decimal, maybe -3.5. Same thing for here, between -3 and -2, I would probably go -2.5. -2 to 2 is good because we can choose 0, and bigger than 2, I would say 3. So we're going to have two decimal ones that we have to plug in, but it'll be okay. -5 plus 3 is negative overall. -5 plus 3 is again negative. So notice, because it's being squared, it kind of cancels itself out, but we still need to think about it. Be careful here. 2 minus -5 would actually change it up to +5, so that's going to be a positive overall. -5 plus 4 is negative. -5 plus 2 is negative. -5 minus 2 more is also negative. So there are an odd number of negatives, which means the overall sign is negative. -3.5 plus 3, that would actually be -0.5, so that's negative. Same thing's going to happen again. 2 minus -3.5 changes to a plus. -3.5 plus 4, that would actually be +0.5. -3.5 plus 2 would be negative. -3.5 minus 2 would be negative. So 4 negatives, that's an even amount, so that makes an overall positive when you multiply and divide. -2.5 plus 3 is positive. Happens again for the second x plus 3. 2 minus a -2.5 changes to 2 plus 2.5, so that would be positive. -2.5 plus 4 is positive. -2.5 plus 2 would be -0.5. -2.5 minus 2 more is negative. We have an even amount of negatives, so that's also going to come out positive. 0 plus 3 is positive, 0 plus 3 is positive, 2 minus 0 is 2, so that's also positive, 0 plus 4 is positive, 0 plus 2 is positive, 0 minus 2 is negative, so one negative, overall sign would be negative. 3 plus 3 is positive, 3 plus 3 is positive, 2 minus 3 would actually be negative, 3 plus 4 is positive, 3 plus 2 is positive, 3 minus 2 is also positive. One negative is an overall negative. Okay, so let's talk about our answer here, because this is a funny case. So we're looking for less than or equal to 0, so that means we want negatives. So notice we have these two back to back with an open circle in between them, so that means you cannot combine it to one interval. If this was closed, we could say, oh, it's just the whole thing. But because it's open, we have to have that gap. But we do have another problem. We don't have negatives on either side of -3, but -3 is definitely a solution because this is when the inequality equals 0, because it's a critical value from the top. So the problem with that is this actually has to be included in our answer. So I always just highlight that because it just represents the number, not the intervals. So how would we write this? So this one was -infinity to, I believe that was -4 with a parentheses, union with, if you have a singular value, you write it in a little set brace, which is two little squigglies, and you just write the single number, which was -3. Union with, up here, this is the interval -2 to 2, and union with the interval 2 to infinity. So this one was very interesting. Quite a few things going on. Much harder than anything we could give you on a test because there's a lot of intervals to test, but I wanted you to see one that had some crazy stuff and some singular values and not always alternating signs. So that's just kind of the nature of the game, is that you can't just always rely on it to be the same pattern. Okay, let's look at D. So we need to factor the denominator first, so this would be 4 plus x and 4 minus x due to perfect squares. Oh, not an equal to, just a less than. So on the top, the 0 is anything that would make the top 0, so that would just be 0. On the bottom, these are things that would make our inequality undefined because they would make us divide by 0. And it looks like it was going to be a -4 and a +4. So remember, this one's open because of the less than. This is always open because the bottom can never be closed. So everything's going to be open this time. So from least to greatest, we would have -4, and then 0, and then 4, all with open circles. This is -infinity to -4 parentheses, parentheses on -4 to 0, 0 to 4, and 4 to infinity. Test values. And we're going to be plugging this into 2x, 4 plus x, and 4 minus x. Rewrite that right there, always open. And we're looking for an overall sign of less than 0. Okay, so our test values, smaller than -4 could be -5. Between -4 and 0, I could do -1. Between 0 and 4, I could do +1. And 4 bigger would be 5. So 2 times -5 is a negative value. 4 minus 5 would be negative. 4 minus a -5 would actually come out positive. Two negatives either multiplied or divided together would be positive. 2 times -1 is negative. 4 minus 1 would be positive. 4 minus a -1 would actually come out to +1, so that's positive overall. One negative makes a negative sign. 2 times 1 is positive. 4 plus 1 is positive. 4 minus 1 is also positive. 3 positives multiplied or divided makes a positive. 2 times 5 is positive. 4 plus 5 is positive, but 4 minus 5 would be -1, so that's negative. So overall sign is negative. So we're looking for less than 0, which means it's these two intervals because they are negative. So my answer would be -4 to 0 union with 4 to infinity. And nothing was a closed circle, so we don't have to worry about any singular points. So it's just those two intervals. Okay, that gets us to the other two I skipped in class, which were F and G. So when you're dealing with this, notice the 0 is not already set up on this side. You must move everything to one side. You cannot cross multiply. This is not an equation, it's an inequality. Cross multiplying is only for equations. So if we try to get a common denominator, I'm going to multiply this side by x minus 5 and this side by 2x plus 3. So that gives me 2x minus 10. Be careful here, this negative needs to get distributed with the 2. So that'd be minus 4x minus 6 all over 2x plus 3x minus 5 less than or equal to 0. Combine what we can on top, so that's -2x minus 16 over 2x plus 3x minus 5 less than or equal to 0. My top, or zeros, these are my critical values. My bottoms, remember, are undefined. So these will be open because bottoms are always opened. And this one goes by whatever the rule is, which is an equal to bar. So these will be closed. Okay, so my 0 from the top. Some people say, should I factor out that -2? It's just going to make your chart harder, so it's better just to think of this as solving it for 0 and just leave it as it is. It's easier to plug into. So I'd add 16 over and then divide by -2. So this would be -8. On the bottom, I would subtract 3 and then divide by 2 if I was solving that. So that'd be -3/2. And if I added 5 over, that would be 5. So I'm going to have to do my chart a little bit lower down here. I'll have to erase this in a minute. So this would be on my number line from least to greatest. -8 would be the smallest. -3/2 would be next smallest. And +5 would be the largest. -8 has a closed circle because it's from the top, and the top applies the equal to if it's there. Everything in the bottom is open. We need test values, and then I need my 3 factors that I'm going to check as I go. 2x plus 3, x minus 5, and then we'll have our overall sign, which we're hoping is less than or equal to 0. So we're looking for negatives again. So smaller than -8 would be -9. Between -8 and -1.5, I could use -2. Bigger than -1.5 but less than 5, I could use 0. And bigger than 5, I could use 6. So -9 times -2 would actually be +18. Minus 16 is +2. 2 times -9 would be -18. Plus 3 would still be negative. -9 minus 5 more is still negative. 2 negatives multiplied or divided together make a positive. -2 times -2 would be +4. 4 minus 16 is actually negative. 2 times -2 would be -4. Plus 3 would be -1, so that's negative. -2 minus 5 more is negative. 3 negatives make a negative. 0 times anything is 0, so that just makes that -16. That makes that one +3. And 0 minus 5 is negative. 2 negatives make a positive overall. -2 times 6 is -12. Take away 16 more, you're going to get more negative. 2 times 6 is 12, plus 3 is positive, and 6 minus 5 is positive. So one negative is an overall negative. We were looking for less than or equal to 0, so that means we want these 2 intervals, and we are good because the -8 that is equal to 0 is included in this interval. So my final answer would be, and I didn't write my intervals up here, but it would be bracket -8 to -3/2 with a parentheses, union with 5 to infinity with both having parentheses. Okay. And then my last one, need to make sure I've got this one down farther. Oops. Let's make it so we can see this one a little bit better. There's where I want to be at. It's adding letters to it, essentially, and it's moving things. Let's back that up. Sorry, Word is temperamental. Let's just copy this and paste it somewhere else. There we go. So this one's actually G. Okay, same idea here. We want to move everything to one side, get a common denominator, because you always want 0 on the other side. So we're going to get a common denominator by multiplying this side by the x minus 3 it's missing, and this side by the 5x plus 1. We're doing that on both top and bottom. I'm just only writing in the top so it doesn't look too busy. So this is 3x minus 9. This needs to be distributed with that 1, so that would be -5x and a -1. You do have to be careful if this is also minus, because minus times minus would be positive, so just make sure you're watching. This is 5x plus 1 and an x minus 3 now. Add like terms on the top, and then we should be able to find our factors. So that'd be a -2x and a -10. Bring everything else down. Okay, so now we need to list out what our zeros and our undefined values are. Zeros come from the top, so I would need to set 2x minus 10 equal to 0 and solve. -2x, I should say. Add 10 over, divide by -2. So -5 is going to obey the inequality rule, which has an equal to. So this one's actually going to be closed. Everything in the bottom should be open always. So this would be a -1 divided by a 5, because if I solve that, and a +3. Okay, so from least to greatest, it would be -5. And it has to be least to greatest, otherwise your intervals are not going to make sense. -1/5, and then +3, putting the closed circle and open appropriately. Intervals would be -infinity to -5 bracket, bracket -5 to -1/5 parentheses, negative 1/5 and a parentheses to 3 with a parentheses, and 3 with a parentheses to infinity. We need to pick a test value, and then we need to plug those into our factors to see if we're going to get overall positives or negatives when we multiply and divide. And the sign we are hoping for this time is pluses because we want greater than or equal to 0. So my test values that I picked, let's see, -6, that goes from negative to positive, so we can, or actually no it doesn't, that's a negative 1/5. So maybe -2. This goes from negative to positive, so we can use 0, and bigger than 3 would be 4. So walk through these carefully. -2 times -6 is +12, but -10 would be +2. 5 times -6 is -30, plus 1 is still going to be negative. -6, take away 3 more is negative. 2 negatives, and the sign grouping part makes a positive. -2 times -2 would be +4, but -10 would still give you a negative. 5 times -2 is -10, plus 1 would be -9, and -2 minus 3 more is negative. 3 negatives multiplied or divided together make a negative. -2 times 0 is 0, minus 10 is negative. 0 plus 1 is positive. 0 minus 3 is negative. 2 negatives make a positive when we multiply or divide. And -2 times 4 would be -8. Take away 10 more is still negative. 5 times 4 is 20, plus 1 would be 21, positive, and 4 minus 3 is positive. Overall, negative sign. So we wanted greater than or equal to 0, so the pluses have it this time, and we're good because our little equal to one is connected to that interval. The only time you have to worry about that is if you have two things that don't work on either side. That's when we have to have the separate little answer for that. So negative infinity to -5 bracket union with -1/5 to 3. And that concludes the notes for this section.